Hello, I'm Laura Evangeline. Welcome. Today I'm creating projects using the new Pretty Pink Posh Valentine release. I'm starting with this new Sweet Cherries stamp set with matching dies and a layering stencil that I think might just match up perfectly. Yep, it sure does with the stamps. To get the background going, I need to pull out a piece of cardstock, and instead of a basic white, I think I'm going to go with a pink so I can pop on some bright red cherries with inks. This tacky mat will help me hold everything in place while I'm stenciling. It also has a grid on it, so I'll be sure to line up my stencil perfectly each time as I change layers. I had a hard time deciding between festive berries and picked raspberry for the cherry colors, so I figured I'll just use both going back and forth between the two colors. The second stencil in this set are the cherry stems, so I chose the color Gathered Twigs. The last stencil in this set are the little cherry leaves, so I chose the colors Mowed Lawn and Cracked Pistachio, alternating back and forth just like I did with the red and pink. I'll set that piece aside for a second and move on to the sentiment layer. This die here I bought previously. It's called Spring Circles, and I haven't used it yet, so I need to snip it apart. I butt the flat end of the snippers up against where I want to cut until the inner die is free. Okay, now here's the trick to prevent any sharp edges. You want to bite down again, but don't cut. Bite down as closely as you can, then twist the die, and that piece will come right off. It stays in your snips. It won't go flying anywhere. So you can take it right over to your trash can, and look, there's no sharp edges left behind. Now that I have the inner circle cut out, I can go ahead and run this through my die cutting machine on some white cardstock. I want to stamp a sentiment next, so I'll take it over and place it on this tacky mat in my stamping platform. The grid will help me line everything up so I can make sure when I place the stamps, everything is lined up before I close the door to pick up the stamps. When I have a brand new stamp set, I like to condition it a little bit by either cleaning it or rubbing my hand over it. This way I get off that factory film and get nice crisp stamping results. I'll ink it up, close the door, press, and reveal a beautifully stamped image. To add color to these cherries, I'll pull the stencils back out and we'll go over those with the same inks I used before. I'm almost ready to use the background, but I think it needs a bit more texture and maybe some glitter. So I'll put the stencil back on, and I pulled out this Pops of Color in the shade Snowflake. I'll use it kind of as a clear glitter paste. The ink I used on the cherries is water reactive, so I don't want the colors to cross-contaminate. So I'll just do a little squirt over each section before swiping it over to press that glitter into the spaces. And ensure I wipe off my spatula before going to the other color. Once this paste dries, it won't wash out very easily, so I'm wiping the spatula off on a disposable baby wipe. And when I'm done here, I'll take this stencil immediately over to my sink to wash it off. Now I think this looks much better. It's glossy, glittery, and has a bit more dimension. I'll set it to the side to dry for a minute and we'll move on. I'd like to add a little bit of glitter to this sentiment tag as well, but before I do, I'll put a little bit of low-tack tape around the edges to protect what I can, before repeating the same steps to add glitter glaze over these cherries as I did before. Pull back the tape and check it out. They're glossy, glittery, and so cute. They just need to set to the side to dry for a few minutes. So while those dry, let's move on to the second project. For this one, I'm starting with the Sweet Note die set. I've traced it onto a piece of white cardstock so I have an idea of where the inks will go as I'm blending. The first color I'm using is Sponge Sugar. I'll ink at the top and also the bottom, so when the card folds, that color hopefully will line up and overlap so it's blending as one. You'll see at the end what I mean. The second color I'm using is a brighter pink called Kitsch Flamingo, followed by a purple called Shaded Lilac. Since there's a bit more space between those purples, I'll add one more stripe of Kitsch Flamingo. The stencil I'm using next is one of the 4 layers of the new Conversation Heart layering stencil set. For a tone-on-tone look, I'm using one shade darker over each of the areas I already blended. So here over the spun sugar, I'm using Kitsch Flamingo. Then I'll move on to using shaded lilac, followed by an even deeper purple called wilted violet to finish it off. Since I use this tacky mat with a grid on it and the stencil pattern repeats, I can easily lift the stencil, move it up, and finish blending the remaining portion of my cardstock. The cardstock's still a little bit damp. I know as the inks dry, they'll settle and blend even better. And I can go ahead and take that note card die and run it through my die cutting machine. Now you can see how cute this die really is. It folds nicely into this little 3x3 card. I do like to burnish the creases with a bone folder. And you can also see here how the light pink inks were at both ends, so they matched up nicely when it's all folded together. The Sweet Note die set also includes this matte layering piece I used to cut out a piece of vellum. I like the detailed border it has, and I'll put it on the card front here. Before I can start stamping, I want to get my die ready to create a jig. I don't like cutting every single die apart unless my card design calls for it. I prefer as many pieces to stay together as possible. There are a few dies here though that are nested inside of others, so I'll need to remove those first. Now I'll take that die and put it on a scrap piece of cardstock and run it through my die cutting machine. Now what I've just created is a jig or template for stamping. I'll save this piece and store it with my stamp set for future use. Now let me show you how I put it to use. I have a sticky grid mat here in my stamping platform. Then I'll take a piece of scrap copy paper, place it down. Then I'll put the jig on top. And since the copy paper is a little smooth, it could wiggle, so I'll tape it in place, or you could use the magnets that came with your stamping platform. Now I'll take each stamp and line it up over each opening before closing the door to secure the stamp, and repeating with each stamp until they're all in place. Now I'm using a gray ink to stamp onto that copy paper to check that the stamps are all aligned how I like them. When I open the door, I see the heart there that I think could move over a tad bit, so I'll adjust it and then re-stamp in black ink so I know where the new stamping is. And then everything looks good, so I can move on to putting in cardstock and using a black ink I know to work nicely with alcohol markers. Since I took those couple extra minutes to line up everything on the platform and the jig, now I can really go to town and stamp rapidly over and over, creating an entire stack of images to color. For coloring, I'm using Copic sketch markers. I'm starting with the leopard, and I've chosen Yellow Red 23, Yellow Red 21, and Yellow Red 20 for the main body. I've also listed these colors here on the screen, and there's a link to my blog post that corresponds with this tutorial where I've listed every single color I've used on each critter. Around the mouth area, I used Yellow Red 20 and Yellow Red Quadruple 0. On the inner ears for the shadowed areas, I used Red Violet 10, and for the highlight areas, Red Triple 0. I wanted the heart-shaped candy box to be purple, and I don't have a lot of colors in my collection just yet, but I found Blue Violet 04 to work for the shadow, Blue 63 for the medium, and Blue Violet 01 for the lighter highlighted areas. Once the candy box was done, I moved on to color the bow. I chose Red Violet 17 for the deepest shade, Red Violet 55 for medium, and Red Violet 63 for the lightest highlight areas. I almost forgot to color the leopard's nose, so I went in all over with Red Violet 10 and used Red Violet 23 on the bottom half as a shadow. The marker I originally went for the panda started to dry out on me, so I went back to my tri-blend markers and pulled out this 3-in-1 color called Ice Gray Shades. Even though I've started collecting Copic markers, I'm not going to say goodbye to my tri-blends anytime soon. I love the colors, they're super easy to use, and they take up a lot less space so they're easy to travel with. If you're looking to start with alcohol markers and maybe find Copics frustrating, overwhelming, or too pricey, I really recommend trying these out first. Just as I did with the other nose, I'm going back to use Red Violet 10 and Red Violet 23 on the panda's nose. Then for the cheeks, I'll do a dot of Red Violet 10 on the panda and leopard. I'll use the same color again later on the koala. You could leave the panda's face white and the belly as well, but since we've used shading in the other areas, I think it can look a little stark. I'm using N0 as the shadow and filling in the rest of the white area with C00. For the little flower the panda is holding, I used Red Violet 29 as the deepest shade, Red Violet 25, and then for the lightest, Red Violet 23. I used these same colors on that candy box you see in the upper right there, and the same purples as I did before for the bow that goes across it. I didn't have Copic markers in colors I thought would work for the koala, but I did have another tri-blend marker I thought worked in the shade Brown Gray Blend. When I was done coloring the koala, I thought he still needed a bit more shadow, so you can see here my marker contains shades 2, 3, and 4, and then this marker called Brown Gray Shades contains deeper tones in shades 5, 6, and 7. I think I want to use just the 5, which is the lightest shade in this marker, and I'll just go around again in the shadow areas to deepen everything up. And I'll go back to the original marker to help blend everything back in together. I think the koala looks much better now, so I can move on to the ears and tummy and cheeks. For the shadow area, I used RV10, and then to fill in the rest of the ears and tummy all over, I used R000. I almost forgot there's a little leaf here. It's so small. I used Yellow Green 13 over the top half as the highlight, and then on the bottom half, I used Yellow Green 17. The little key the koala is holding is so small, I didn't trust myself not to get out of the lines, so I pulled out a gel pen in gold, and I loved it so much that I went back over the little candy boxes and added a bunch of little dots. So now everything's nice and shiny, and all that's left to do is put on our die, which fits perfectly because we stamped everything using a jig earlier. So now one cut, one pass through the die cutting machine, and they're all cut out at once. Now that I have a little pile of cut and colored critters, I'm ready to go back to the note card. A hot pink cardstock circle was cut out using the Halloween Circles die set. I added a bit of foam adhesive to the back before attaching it to the center of this vellum square. Then I'm using a little bit of tape runner just to hold down these balls of thread. I want them to stay in place while I get ready to add the next layer. Before I add the little critters, I think they could use a little bit of highlight using a white gel pen. Then, once they're dry, because I don't want the gel pen to smear, I'll add foam adhesive to the back and then use a little bit of liquid glue to attach them to the front. Because there's so much texture underneath them with the thread and textured cardstock, I really want to make sure they dry and stay in place. I think there's room for a little bit of bling on this project, so I have these metallic gold pearls from Pretty Pink Posh, and I'll just glue them on in a few spots, and I think that just about does it. I have several more of these to put together for my son's Valentine's. I hope you like it, but in the meantime, let's check on that cherry background we had drying off to the side. Everything looks good now, so we're ready to get cracking on assembling this card. The card base I have to work with is A2, top folding, which means it's 4 1/4 wide by 5 1/2 tall. I'd like about a 1/4 inch border around the edge where the white shows, so I need to take a 1/2 inch off each side, leaving me with this cherry piece to be 3 3/4 wide by 5 inches tall. Everything else is super easy. I'll use foam adhesive to attach this cherry piece to the center of the card base, and then I'll add foam adhesive to the back of the die cut tag sentiment. I'll also add a little bit of liquid adhesive on this one since there's texture underneath with that glitter gel that we added earlier. This will ensure that as the card dries, everything will be locked in place. Okie dokie, that's 2 projects down. We have 1 more to go. For this last one, I'll start with the rest of the die cuts we didn't use, the koala, panda, the words love and hugs, and the little candy box as well. I missed adding the little gel pen accents in gold and white on the candy box earlier, so I'll go ahead and do that so it has time to dry before I mess with it any further. To get started on the tag bases, I'll cut out a few shades of cardstock in whites and pinks using the Stitched Banner Duo 1 die set, and then the circles, I'll use that same Halloween circles die set that we used earlier. I'll add a bit of foam adhesive to the back of each of the die cut circles, as well as to the back of the panda, koala, and the little heart candy box as well. I laid out all my pieces and was just about ready to get everything assembled, but then I thought it looked a little bland, so I took the tag bases over to my tacky mat, and then I splattered on a bit of a clear shimmer ink, a white pigment, and then a gold glittery ink as well, and then set it aside to dry. In the meantime, I used tape runner on each of the circles to help tack down this metallic gold thread. Then I added a little bit of liquid adhesive to the foam on the back of the little critters and attached those on top of the circles. My tag bases are dry now, so I can go ahead and remove those. I'll use a bit of tape runner to secure them in place on the white cardstock tag bases, slightly canted so they peek out from behind. I'll use an eyelet on these, so it's okay if the adhesive isn't quite as aggressive as I had used in all the other steps. The tool I'm using here is called a crocodile. I will punch a hole in the top of each tag, then place an eyelet, and use the crimper to clamp them down and set them in place. Liquid adhesive was used to attach the sentiments to the bottom of each tag, as well as these little die cut circles with the critters on top. All that's left to do is add a bit of yarn or twine, and your tags are ready to go. Okay, let's see how these look with our other projects. Our tags, our sweet note card, and our cherry card that we started with. If you need the supply list for any of these projects, you can check the description box below. There's also a link to the corresponding blog post. Otherwise, I want to thank you for sharing your crafty time with me today. I hope to create with you again very soon. Until next time, stay crafty.